Margaret Turner never expected her life to shift on what began as an ordinary evening. But sometimes life changed quietly, slipping in through small moments that didn't seem important until later. The night of her daughter Emily's birthday, dinner had started with warm laughter, homemade food, and the kind of joy that made Margaret feel grateful for her simple life in a quiet Seattle suburb. Emily had married Daniel Hayes a few years earlier. Man everyone agreed was steady and gentle, someone who made even the loudest room feel calm. Margaret liked him, respected him, and had always thought of him as the kind of man who kept his feelings carefully folded away. But as the night wound down, something shifted in a way Margaret couldn't explain. After the dishes were stacked and the birthday candles were blown out, Emily stepped outside to take a work call, leaving Margaret and Daniel alone in the kitchen with nothing but the soft hum of the dishwasher and the faint smell of warm vanilla cake. It should have been a normal moment, just a mother-in-law and son-in-law cleaning up together, but the air felt strangely still, as if waiting for something. Daniel passed her a dish towel, and their hands brushed lightly, a tiny, unimportant touch. But his reaction caught her off guard. He stopped just for a second, and when he looked up at her, his eyes held hers longer than they should have. It wasn't a romantic stare or anything inappropriate. It wasn't bold or intense. It was searching, curious, almost confused, like he had seen something in her he hadn't expected and wasn't sure what to do with the realization. Margaret felt her chest tighten, not with excitement, but with surprise. Like the air had shifted and she couldn't understand why. She gave a small smile and stepped away, pretending nothing unusual had passed between them, but she could still feel that moment lingering like a warm echo. Daniel quickly looked down at the plate he was drying, and for a second he seemed embarrassed, as if he hadn't meant for his thoughts to show. But his face, normally calm and unreadable, held a softness she had never seen before. It made her wonder what storm might be quietly sitting inside him. She finished placing the dishes away, her hands moving automatically while her mind tried to make sense of that brief, strange moment. Daniel wasn't someone who crossed boundaries, wasn't someone who played emotional games. If anything, he often kept too much inside. Why had his eyes looked like that, curious, unsure, almost lonely? Before she could gather her thoughts, the back door opened and Emily walked in, smiling as she tucked her phone away and wrapped her arms around Daniel. He smiled back, but something about the smile felt thin, as if he had quickly put it on. Margaret saw it, but said nothing. She had learned over the years that people often hid the things they didn't know how to explain. They finished cleaning up and everyone said goodnight. But even as Margaret closed her bedroom door, the memory of that look lingered stubbornly. She lay awake longer than she wanted to, staring at the dim ceiling, replaying the moment over and over like a scene she couldn't quite interpret. She wasn't flattered. She wasn't confused in a romantic way. She was simply unsettled, because something in that glance had seemed fragile, almost like a silent question, and she didn't know what he had been trying to ask. She reminded herself that she was 53, long past the age of letting her imagination run wild. She was a mother, a grandmother-to-be someday, someone who had lived enough life to know the difference between real danger and simple human vulnerability. Yet that night the memory crawled into the quiet corners of her mind and refused to leave. Margaret had always thought she was good at reading people years of raising a child. Alone had sharpened that skill, but Daniel's expression had slipped past her defenses in a way she couldn't easily categorize. It wasn't desire. It wasn't admiration. It was something heavier, something lonely, something like a person who suddenly noticed someone else truly seeing them for the first time. She turned onto her side, pulling the blanket tighter, breathing slowly through the strange ache settling. In her chest, it wasn't about attraction. It wasn't about lines or danger. It was the human truth beneath it. She had seen someone hurting if she didn't yet understand why, and that realization stayed with her. By morning, life returned to its familiar rhythm. Margaret made coffee, watered her plants, and told herself that she had imagined the whole thing, that maybe she had been tired, or maybe Daniel had simply been overwhelmed from the long work week. But even then, even as she pushed the moment aside and tried to move on, a quiet, stubborn question stayed with her. Something had changed in his eyes that night. Something he hadn't meant to reveal. Something she knew would come back to her sooner or later. She just didn't know how soon. Asterisk in the days after that quiet, confusing moment in the kitchen. Margaret tried to convince herself nothing unusual had happened, but the change in Daniel became impossible to ignore. Normally, he filled a room with calm energy, but now he moved like someone carrying invisible weight, speaking less, smiling only when necessary, and slipping away from family dinners with polite excuses that didn't match the exhaustion in his eyes. Emily brushed it off, saying he was stressed and dealing with a difficult project at work. But Margaret sensed something deeper in the way he avoided meeting her gaze, as if that one moment had opened a door he didn't know how to close. One evening, after a long week of rain and dim skies, Margaret stepped out to the backyard with a mug of tea and found Daniel sitting alone on the porch steps. He hadn't heard her come out, and the look on his face, tired, distant, almost lost, was so different from the man she knew that she felt a pull of concern before she could talk herself out of it. She considered turning back inside, not wanting to intrude, but the way he stared into the dark trees made her stay. She walked over slowly and asked if he was all right. He didn't jump or pretend to smile. Instead, he sighed with a kind of honesty. People only show when they can't hold everything inside anymore. His voice was quiet, strained, the kind that came from someone trying desperately to keep themselves together. He didn't explain much, just said he was doing his best, which somehow made her worry more than a full confession would have. Margaret sat beside him, but left enough space to make the moment comfortable. She didn't want to push him or make him feel watched. She simply told him she cared, not as a mother-in-law, but as someone who understood what sadness looked like in another person. He glanced her way, and for the first time in days, its expression softened, though it held a deep uncertainty she couldn't place. When he thanked her, his voice carried a sincerity that felt too real, too raw, like those words had been waiting a long time to be said to someone. That night, the distance between them wasn't about boundaries or confusion. It was about human connection. Two people sitting quietly in the dark, both pretending the world wasn't heavier than usual. After that night, Daniel didn't return to normal. Stayed quiet, but the quiet had changed. It wasn't tired silence anymore, it was emotional distance. It's a soft pulling away from everything, even Emily. Margaret watched him carefully without letting him know, noticing how his shoulders tensed whenever Emily called his name or how he hesitated before answering simple questions. Emily, always busy with deadlines and meetings, barely noticed. She assumed Daniel's silence meant he needed space, and she gave it freely, which only seemed to push him further into his own thoughts. Margaret felt stuck between wanting to help and knowing she couldn't step into their marriage. She knew how complicated relationships could get, how communication sometimes faded long before people admitted something was wrong. And she feared Daniel was reaching a breaking point he had no name for. One afternoon, while dropping off a casserole she had promised to make, she found him sitting at the dining table, staring at a stack of untouched mail. He looked up quickly when she walked in, masking whatever emotion had been there a second before. He tried to smile but couldn't quite manage it. That small failure made her heart squeeze in a way she didn't expect. She asked if he needed help with anything, and he shook his head too fast, as if afraid to open his mouth and let something spill out. The more he tried to hide, the more she saw the truth lingering beneath every forced breath and polite nod. Yet she still said nothing, reminding herself that boundaries existed for a reason. But that didn't stop her from thinking about him long after she left the house. It didn't stop her from worrying about the man who had once been steady and calm but now seemed untethered, drifting away from the life he had built. It didn't stop her from replaying the way his eyes had softened on the porch, revealing a quiet pain he didn't seem able to share with anyone else. And it didn't stop her from wondering whether that moment in the kitchen, the one she had tried so hard to ignore, had been the first sign of everything beginning to unravel. A week later, she saw him again at a small family dinner. He barely ate, he barely spoke. And when Emily joked about him being too serious lately, he laughed. But the sound fell flat, didn't reach his eyes. It didn't carry warmth. Margaret sat there, taking in the subtle cracks forming in him. And she realized something important. Daniel wasn't pulling away because of her. He was pulling away because something inside him was quietly breaking. And despite every logical thought telling her to stay uninvolved, she couldn't shake the feeling that sooner or later he would turn to her again, because he shouldn't. But because he had no one else who noticed the quiet details, the soft signs, the unspoken fears. She didn't know then how soon that moment would come or how deeply it would shake both of them. But she could feel it in the air, in the silence, in the weight Daniel carried every time he walked into a room. The distance wasn't just growing, it was calling. And she knew she wouldn't be able to ignore it. Asterisk, the week after that quiet, tension-filled period seemed to stretch endlessly, and Margaret couldn't stop thinking about Daniel. Every time she saw him, she noticed the subtle changes. It's the way his shoulders slumped slightly more. It's the way his eyes darted away when Emily mentioned future plans or small household matters. It was clear something inside him was unsettled. Something he hadn't shared with anyone, not even with Emily. Then one evening a storm rolled in. Rain hammering against the windows and wind rattling the trees, and Emily had been called out of town for work, leaving Margaret and Daniel alone in the house again. The quiet was heavy, almost oppressive, and Margaret could feel a tension in the air she couldn't ignore. Daniel appeared at the back door, soaked from the rain, his coat sticking to his frame, his hair damp, his usual calm presence replaced by something raw and uncertain. Margaret instinctively fetched a towel and handed it to him, but he didn't move quickly to dry himself. Instead, he stood there for a moment, taking in the kitchen, the familiar space that suddenly felt strange. His voice was low, almost breaking. When he spoke, "We're in trouble," he admitted quietly, the words falling into the room like heavy stones. Margaret froze, unsure if she should respond immediately, but she simply nodded, encouraging him without words to continue. He swallowed, his eyes meeting hers briefly, then darting away again as he tried to gather himself. She says, "I'm too quiet, too gentle. That being with me feels like living in a whisper," he confessed, his hands tightening around the edge of the counter as if gripping for strength. Margaret's heart twisted at his words, a mixture of sympathy and worry flooding her chest. She had seen how much he cared for Emily, how carefully he had built their life together, and the thought of that love faltering made her ache. She sat down at the kitchen table across from him, her presence calm and unthreatening, giving him space while showing that she was there to listen. "It's not your fault, Daniel," she said softly, trying to give him comfort without offering solutions he wasn't ready for. "Sometimes people don't see things the same way, even when the love is real. Being gentle isn't a weakness. It's who you are." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw a flicker of something he had been hiding: vulnerability. Fear, exhaustion, and maybe even relief at finally being understood by someone who wasn't judging him. He let out a breath he had been holding for days, maybe weeks, and the sound carried a mixture of frustration and quiet despair. Margaret felt a tug in her chest, not romantic, but deeply human. She understood what it was like to love someone fully and yet feel helpless when they couldn't return the support in the way you needed. She knew the ache of silent suffering, the way it could stretch across a room and go unnoticed until it was almost too late. Daniel's eyes met hers again, lingering longer this time, filled with a raw honesty that made Margaret's own heart feel heavy. She wanted to reach out, to comfort him in some way, but she restrained herself. Remembering boundaries, knowing that Emily's absence complicated everything, but didn't excuse crossing lines that couldn't be undone. Instead, she offered him a quiet presence, letting him sit with his emotions without having to explain them further. Letting him know that someone saw him, truly saw him, even if for a moment. For a while, neither spoke, just sitting in the kitchen as the storm pounded outside. The rain against the windows, a steady rhythm that mirrored the tension inside both of them. Margaret could see how exhausted he was, how much weight he carried. Silently, and she felt a mixture of concern and empathy that she couldn't dismiss. It was a strange connection, born not of romance, but of shared understanding. A fragile human bond that reminded them both that they were not entirely alone. Eventually, Daniel spoke again, voice quieter, this time almost a whisper. "I don't know how to fix myself for her," he admitted. And Margaret felt the words land like shards, not just revealing his fear about Emily, but the unspoken fear of failing at something he truly cared about. She wanted to reassure him, to give him answers, but she knew he didn't need solutions. He needed acknowledgement, someone to witness his struggle and hold it as real without judgment. "You are enough," she said softly, her voice carrying more conviction than she had intended. "You are who you are, and that matters. Sometimes the world doesn't see it. Sometimes the people closest to us don't, but it doesn't make you less." Daniel looked at her then, his eyes searching hers with a quiet intensity. And Margaret felt the air between them shift slightly, charged with something unspoken. It wasn't desire, not in any way that threatened Emily or their family, but it was a moment of human truth, of two people recognizing pain, longing, and the fragile nature of connection. She realized then that their bond had changed, had deepened, in a way that could not be undone, even if it never became anything overt. They were both aware of it, sitting in the stormlit kitchen, sharing a silence that spoke louder than any words could. Time seemed suspended, each tick of the clock carrying the weight of unspoken feelings and hidden fears. Margaret knew she would remember this night, remember the way Daniel's voice faltered and his eyes looked at her not as a son-in-law or a friend, but as someone searching for understanding, someone seeking refuge in an unexpected place. And Daniel, for his part, seemed to find some quiet relief in sharing even a fragment of his inner turmoil, recognizing that Margaret, in her gentle wisdom and steady presence, could see him in a way no one else had recently. As the storm outside eased, the room grew quieter, but the emotional intensity remained. Neither of them spoke of it directly, and yet the moment had changed everything. Margaret realized she had stepped into a delicate balance, place of human empathy and moral restraint. And she knew that in the days to come, they would both carry the memory of this night, of the storm, and of the brief, fragile connection they had shared. She understood that life often put people together in moments they didn't expect, offering insight and comfort in ways that were complicated but necessary. And as Daniel finally rose to leave, shoulders slightly lighter, Margaret felt a mixture of relief and apprehension, knowing that what had passed between them was powerful and important, even if neither could fully name it. The house returned to its quiet state, the storm having passed. The emotional storm inside both of them lingered, leaving Margaret with a strange mixture of worry, hope, and the undeniable recognition that sometimes the human heart found connection in the most unlikely moments, changing everything in ways that were subtle but unforgettable. The morning after the storm brought a quiet clarity to the house. But the tension that had built between Margaret and Daniel lingered, heavier now because of what had been shared the night before. Margaret had spent the night replaying the moments, over and over. The way Daniel had looked at her, the way he had spoken with a raw honesty she had rarely seen. And she realized that their connection, fragile as it was, had shifted something in both of them. When she entered the kitchen that morning, she found him already there, quietly making coffee. The air between them filled with unspoken thoughts. He didn't look up immediately, as if afraid to meet her eyes, but she could feel the weight he carried, the uncertainty, the frustration, the self-doubt that had been eating at him for weeks. He moved slowly, deliberately, his hands shaking slightly as he poured a cup. And Margaret understood that whatever resolution he sought wasn't something she could give him directly. She stayed at the doorway, observing, and noticed the subtle signs of exhaustion, the lines on his forehead, the slight slump in his shoulders, the way his fingers lingered on the edge of the counter as if holding onto something steady. Finally, he turned to her eyes, soft but filled with conflict, and Margaret could see that he had made a decision, even if he didn't yet know exactly what it meant for his life. "I shouldn't come here like this," he said quietly, voice steadying as he tried to assert control over his emotions. "It isn't fair to you. Or to Emily." Margaret nodded, understanding immediately the truth in his words. She had felt the emotional pull, the quiet connection. But she also knew boundaries existed for a reason. Family, loyalty, respect, these were things neither of them could ignore, no matter how complicated the human heart might be. She moved closer, standing beside him, but kept enough distance to give him space, letting him feel the weight of the decision he had to make without interference. "Your family, Daniel," she said softly, her voice calm but firm, "and I care about you. That won't change, but you and Emily. Your story isn't finished yet." Her words carried conviction, not emotion that crossed lines, and Daniel seemed to absorb them, his shoulders relaxing just slightly. He looked down at his coffee cup, turning it in his hands, as if finding strength in the warmth. And Margaret felt the relief of knowing that he had chosen clarity over confusion, responsibility over temptation. But even as he stood there, ready to leave, Margaret could see the hesitation in his eyes, the flicker of emotions he hadn't yet named. It was the same look he had given her that first night in the kitchen, searching, uncertain, vulnerable. And yet it now carried acceptance, a readiness to face reality, even if it wasn't easy. He stepped toward the door, coat in hand, and paused as if compelled to say something that could not be fully expressed in words. "You're a stronger person than you know, Margaret," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "You see people. You really see them. And thank you for not letting me fall apart." Margaret's heart caught at his words, not because they carried romance, but because they held recognition, gratitude, and a human honesty that was rare in life. She smiled gently, a mixture of reassurance and understanding, letting him know that she had witnessed him, acknowledged him without judgment or expectation. "Go fight for your marriage," she said softly, her words carrying warmth and authority, "and for yourself." He nodded, a firm, single motion that anchored him back to his responsibilities, and stepped out into the morning light. Margaret closed the door slowly, feeling a mix of emotions, relief that he had chosen the right path, sadness that the connection they had felt would remain unspoken, and a quiet hope that he would find the strength he needed to repair what had been strained. The house felt empty without him, yet the memory of the stormy night, the kitchen, and the shared vulnerability remained vivid in her mind. Margaret understood something important then. Life often offered moments of human connection that were brief, intense, and transformative, even if they could never manifest in obvious ways. It wasn't about romance or crossing boundaries. It was about witnessing another person's struggle and being present when no one else could. She realized that the bond she had formed with Daniel, fleeting as it was, would remain with her as a reminder of empathy, compassion, and the power of human understanding. As the morning sun filtered through the windows, casting gentle light across the kitchen, Margaret reflected on the strange, emotional journey she had been part of. She knew she had made the right choice by remaining calm, by offering support, without overstepping, and by allowing Daniel to face his own life and choices with clarity. And yet, in the quiet moments, she could still feel the echo of his gaze. That searching, vulnerable look that had started everything, lingering in her memory like a soft whisper she would carry with her. Margaret moved through the house, tidying up and sipping her coffee, feeling a bittersweet mix of satisfaction and melancholy. She understood that this chapter in her life had been important, not because it changed her daily routine, but because it reminded her of the depth of human emotion, the weight of responsibility, and the fragile beauty of connection. Daniel's decision to leave, to fight for his marriage and face his challenges head-on, had lifted a burden from both of them. Yet it left behind a subtle tension, a memory of something intense, honest, and unspoken. She knew that in the days to come, Emily would return and life would continue with its familiar rhythm. But the house would always hold that quiet space where truths had been shared, where someone had been seen and understood in a way that could never be erased. Margaret felt the subtle ache of longing, not of romance, but of human closeness, and she understood that this experience had changed her in ways she could not yet fully articulate. It had taught her patience, empathy, and the complex reality of caring deeply for someone without letting emotions overstep boundaries. And as she moved to the window, watching Daniel walk down the street toward his car, the morning light reflecting on the rain-soaked pavement, she whispered to herself, not in sadness, but in quiet acknowledgement, life gives you moments you cannot fully explain, moments that shape who you are and how you see others. And sometimes, those moments are enough to change everything without ever needing to cross a line. The day continued, the house filling with sunlight and the gentle sounds of suburban life. Yet Margaret carried the memory of Daniel's gaze, his words, and the stormy night in her heart, a reminder that human connection, even brief and complicated, could leave lasting impressions that define courage, understanding, and the quiet strength of the human spirit.